Hello, welcome. My name's Neil Gostling. I'm a lecturer in evolution and paleobiology at the University of Southampton.
And I'm Sarah Darwin, and I'm a researcher at the Natural History Museum in Berlin.
Welcome to Darwin's Armchair. We want to share a number of online events with you over the next few weeks and months, covering various different topics, but all on the theme of Darwin, evolution and biodiversity.
We want Darwin's Armchair we'll be sharing, we want Darwin's Armchair to be like a discussion. And in later episodes, we'll be inviting guests to join us who also feel as strongly and as passionately as we do about Darwin's work. We would like to welcome questions from you all, so please pop them in the chat below.
So this is the introduction to our series, and we're going to kick it off by celebrating Darwin's birthday, as we usually do, but not necessarily, well, definitely not in the way that we normally do today.
So Neil, what do you normally do?
Well, in a normal year, I'd be going to lectures, maybe having a dinner, thinking about Charles Darwin. What would you be up to?
Well, probably doing something very similar, but certainly raising a glass of wine.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic has certainly it's really changed our plans, and if anything, though, I think it really shows the relevance of Charles Darwin to us today. We're in a world now with mutating viruses, new variants. It's a really dynamic, evolving situation. But what does evolution mean? Do the people here know what it means?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. The term mutating viruses, a year ago, we never would have believed it would have been in the news so much. And we've all likely heard of Darwin, and you've probably heard of On the Origin of Species. And we all think we know what evolution means, but how many of us can actually explain it? I decided that as part of Darwin's celebration for his birthday, that I would reread On the Origin of Species in honor.
So we thought that what we would do then is that today we could take you through evolution by natural selection and discuss what Darwin said. It's really important to remember that when Darwin introduced the book to the world that he was living in, there was a widespread belief, the widespread belief really in Europe, was that there was a creative being who had fashioned plants and animals in the form that they are today in the last few thousand years. Indeed, in the 17th century, Bishop Ussher in Ireland had calculated that the age of the Earth, he'd worked out who had begat whom in the Bible and so on, and he'd worked out that the world had come into being at 5 p.m. on October the 22nd, 4004 BC, and therefore October the 23rd was the first day. However, by the time of Darwin, other areas of science were starting to develop and challenging these sort of commonly held beliefs.
Yeah, I love the way he was so precise, 5 p.m. on the 22nd. So Charles Lyell wrote a book called Principles of Geology in 1830, and Darwin took this on the voyage of the Beagle. And the key to Lyell's theory is that changes to the Earth's crust take place over vast lengths of time and through small steps. And during Darwin's voyage on the Beagle, he actually saw seashells on the tops of mountains in the Andes, and he even experienced an earthquake. And the Beagle crew members reported to Darwin that this caused a small uplift of the local coastline in Chile, because they found mussels higher up the shore than before.
That's exactly right. I mean, these emerging sciences of geology and actually ideas before Darwin, such as the theory put forward of evolution, put forward by Lamarck in 1809, his zoology, philosophy of zoology, these were all in Darwin's mind. And so when Darwin eventually comes to writing down his work in The Origin, he's bringing together all of these ideas. Lamarck, Lyell, von Humboldt, and his descriptions of the natural world, and he brings it all together into this beautiful, complete narrative on the subject.
Yeah, and of course that included Alfred Russel Wallace, who had come to a very similar conclusion to Darwin and had written to Darwin and in a letter outlined his theory. Darwin had been sitting on his theory of natural selection for over 20 years, and this letter from Wallace prompted Darwin to publish On the Origin of Species.
Absolutely. I mean, there is this popular portrait that's painted of almost an animosity between the two, but it's complete nonsense. The idea that Wallace was unfairly treated, it simply isn't the case. Wallace later wrote a book all about evolution and natural selection and the state of the art, if you like, and he called it Darwinism. He coined that term.
Yeah, and of course, Darwin and Wallace corresponded for decades, their entire lives.
Absolutely, they were good friends. I suppose now it's an opportunity. I suppose now we could talk about the actual book. We could talk about The Origin of Species.
Yeah, and I thought it'd be fun to start with a nice quote from Darwin. And one of the things I really like about The Origin of Species is that if you actually open the very last page and look at the very last paragraph, Darwin very nicely sums the entire theory up for you. So if you out there don't feel like reading the entire book, you can just go straight to the last paragraph and he sums it up. So I'll just read a few lines from that final bit. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, and various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and so dependent on one another in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, which is almost implied by reproduction, variability from the indirect and direct action of external conditions of life, and from use and disuse. A ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection. And I gather, Neil, that you do a pretty good summary of On the Origin. What is it, 4 chapters in 4 minutes?
The first 4 chapters give you the whole mechanism. The rest of the book is his evidence for what he's setting out in the first 4 chapters. But the first 4 chapters is the meat of it. And I will try and do a chapter a minute. We'll intersperse. We'll have some discussion. I'm not going to do it straight the way through. But Darwin was an absolutely brilliant writer. And he introduces ideas and concepts. They're really obvious, okay? And he leads people through from one obvious position to the next idea. And he starts off by telling people things that they understand. And in chapter 1, he calls it Variation under Domestication. And he uses examples of cows, cats, dogs, all sorts of things that people would have been aware of. I say people would have been aware of, people at the time. We are less involved with nature now, living in cities. Most people lived in the countryside and were maybe farm labourers, or there were a large proportion of the population was involved in that sort of work, and so they would have understood what domestication is. They would have understood that people would have taken an organism, they would have bred it in such a way that it gives you the characteristics that we think are useful. So an extra woolly sheep, or an extra muscly cow, or all these sort of things. And Darwin wrote prolifically. He wrote dozens of letters every day, and he contacted plant and animal breeders, asking them for examples of how they had selected the different animals, the different characters that they wanted, that ultimately ended up in the breeds that they had. We can go back further than this, though. We can actually look at one of the closest relationship that any animal and any 2 animals have, and maybe humans and dogs is a brilliant one. And he does make reference to wolves being domesticated by humans. And the thing that we would have done is we would have selected those wolves which were tamest, those ones which came up to us and didn't run away. We would have taken those, we would have bred them together. And so that would have given us the tame characteristic coming through. And over generations and generations and generations, we've bred for different characteristics. So we've got good sight hounds like retrievers. We've got animals that are dogs that are brilliant for herding, such as border collies. We've even, I always get surprised by this one because staffies get such a bad rep. But Staffordshire Bull Terriers were one of their jobs. One of the things that they were bred for and used for was actually for as like a nursery dog, guarding the children in the crib. This process of selection, though, has led to animals as different from wolves as the metre-tall Great Dane, or a Chihuahua that can fit in your handbag if that's the sort of thing you're into. But it's just remarkable.
Yeah, and of course, some dogs have a superb sense of smell. For example, you can sometimes see beagles at airports to detect drugs. And even some dogs have been trained to smell cancer and COVID-19, for example. So I wonder why it is, Neil, do you think that Darwin would start a book about natural selection and start talking about domesticated animals?
I mean, I sort of believe it, but I think it's something that people could relate to. Again, 1850s, people are living in a time when they believe that species didn't change. They believed that they'd been specially created and they hadn't changed throughout the entire history of the life, of the Earth. But by using examples from farming, Darwin shows that even humans can take these wonderful, perfect beings, perfect creatures, and modify them to suit our needs.
Yeah, and it would have been normal for people to have animals around, for example, cats to catch rats and things. Excuse me. So the variations that we see in animals and plants are natural, and we now know that they're caused by mutations. And man uses these variations to his advantage. And there's a really nice quote that sums up this chapter on variation of domestication. Nature gives us successive variations. Man adds them up in certain directions useful to himself. And in a sense, he may be said to make himself useful breeds.
Absolutely. So Darwin also, he refers to this book, refers to On the Origin as one long argument. And I really like the way that he keeps his arguments simple. He uses examples that people understand, and he's consistent. And not only that, he states the same things in slightly different ways. So each time he's carrying you along so that you understand what he's saying. I mean, I really like the way that Darwin often poses questions that later in the book he gives the answers to. And I mean, have you found a quote that could explain that?
When I've finished coughing, I've got a very nice quote. So Darwin says, "Can the principle of selection, which we have seen in so potent in the hands of man, apply in nature?" Which takes us very nicely up to chapter 2.
Absolutely. So in chapter 2, which is the variation under nature, this is where Darwin first brings in the ideas of Lyell, the long age of the Earth, the slow processes. And it's not that the slow processes are inherently important to Darwin itself, but the fact that processes are slow gives Darwin time that he needs. It's really important here that we have an old Earth, because for nature and the environment to affect the characteristics of a population, it needs a long time to sculpt generations, not an individual. It's not changing an individual, but it's changing a generation, long lineage. Okay, so although Darwin really didn't recognize them as such, the Galapagos finches that were flitting all around everywhere when Darwin got to the islands in 1835, they are a perfect example of how animals have adapted to different environments, different habitats actually within an environment, so that they can take full advantage of it. And the finches, they're wonderful little birds. They're incredibly friendly. You aren't meant to get too close to them, but they don't know the rules and they come up to you. But the thing that we notice about them is that they have different beaks. Beaks are how birds interact with the environment. So their beaks have evolved so that they can do just that. So and birds with very large beaks can take advantage of large, hard nuts, whereas birds with smaller beaks are able to pull grubs out of the bark in the trees. It's beautiful, and this is adapting to habitats within an island. They're not different birds on different islands; they're different birds in different habitats on the same island. Really, it's wonderful.
And of course, the Galapagos Islands are volcanic in origin, and therefore, when the first waves lapped against the shores of the very first island, they were completely barren, and eventually animals and plants colonized from the mainland of South America, which is around 1,000 kilometers away, and which is where we think the ancestral finches came from.
Absolutely. And this is really important, and getting this understanding. Actually, if you end up in a novel environment, there's going to be pressures on you. Okay, not every seed will germinate from a dandelion head. Not every egg will hatch. Not every animal that does germinate or hatch actually makes it through to maturity to breed. And this is really crucial. What Darwin does is he demonstrates this by calculating the number of elephants that would result from a single pair with a given birth rate. And this is one of my favorite quotes. So he says, the elephant is reckoned to be the slowest breeder of all known animals, and I have taken some pains to estimate its probable minimum state of natural increase. It will be under the mark to assume that it begins breeding when 30 years old and goes on breeding until 90 years old, bringing forth 3 pair of young in this interval. If this be so, by the end of the 5th century, there will be alive 15 million elephants descended from this first pair. That's a lot of elephants. We don't have that. Closer to home, even. I mean, you wouldn't notice it to look out the window at the moment, but days are getting longer. Allegedly, it's going to start getting warmer soon, and those first flowers will pop up through our lawns. And guaranteed that one of the first ones that will pop up will be a dandelion, and that will be from a seed from last year. Each flower head tends to produce 100, well, on average, 112 seeds. And there's 2 generations. So 112 times 112, you can work it out. But over 3 years, that gives you 1.76 trillion dandelions. We are not up to 1.76 trillion dandelions from my back garden. So clearly, not everything that is produced goes on to survive. And actually, for a stable population, all you need to do is to have one seed from one plant survive. And Darwin shows this, so that there is, why don't things survive? And I think that's because there is variation. And this is another beautiful quote that sums this up beautifully. Owing to this struggle for life, any variation, however slight, and from whatever cause proceeding, if in any degree profitable to an individual of any species in its infinitely complex relations to other organic beings and to external nature, it will tend to the preservation of that individual and will generally be inherited by its offspring. So what he's saying is there is variation. Not every environment something finds itself in will be able to cope, will be able to reach maturity, and will be able to reproduce. But if you've got a little bit of if the variation just gives you the edge, you're going to manage to get to reproduce, and you'll pass your characteristics onto the offspring. And that brings us right to chapter 4, natural selection. And this is the crux. This is the whole thing. This is what we're waiting for. Okay. And he shows that nature, the environment, it sculpts populations by affecting the success of individuals in reaching maturity and reproducing. So if you have characters that get you to reproductive age, and you have offspring that you've passed those traits on to, those characteristics are successful, and those characteristics will continue. It's not just about necessarily individual populations dying, though. Individuals dying if they haven't got those characters. What it's saying is those individuals in given environments can succeed, can do really, really well at the expense of those that don't have those characters. But let's take an example for a moment. Okay, if you've got a population of plants and some of the dandelions, some of those seeds do really well in drained soils, and some of those seeds are quite content to survive in waterlogged soils. what you'll get is the seeds that can survive in waterlogged soils. This is just a silly example, that a thought experiment. The waterlog loving seeds will be quite happy in soggy valley bottoms, and the drought or drained loving seeds will be quite happy further up the mountain. And eventually, over time, you get different populations. They'll separate from one another, and over time they'll separate into different species. This is the origin of species.
Absolutely. No, that's that's a good way. And there's a lovely quote which explains what you've said in Darwin's words. And note here again how he uses animals that everyone's familiar with in order to make this really accessible to the lay person. In order to make it clear how, as I believe, natural selection acts, I must beg permission to give one or two imaginary illustrations. Let us take the case of a wolf who preys on various animals, securing some by craft, some by strength, and some by fleetness. And let us suppose that the fleetest prey, a deer for instance, had, for any change in the country, increased in numbers, or that prey had decreased in numbers during that season of the year when the wolf is hardest pressed for food. I can, under such circumstances, see no reason to doubt that the swiftest and slimmest wolves would have had the best chance of surviving, and so be preserved or selected. I see no more reason to doubt this than that man can improve the fleetness of his greyhounds by carefully and methodically selecting. Some of its young would probably inherit the same habits or structure.
It's lovely. And there, what Darwin has done, it's really clever, because what he's done, he's rounded out natural selection by bringing back in selecting greyhounds, domestication, and human selection for traits that we want, to again explain beautifully the argument that he's trying to make. It's just lovely. So that's it. That's in a nutshell, that's evolution by natural selection. We can change things. Nature changes things much more effectively. Not everything that's born will survive to be able to reproduce, because there's variation in populations, and some things just do better than others. And that's natural selection. Boom, 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 boom. Easy. So I've done it in less than 4 minutes. I think I just explained it in about 15 seconds.
I don't know what clock you're looking at.
So we've got, why does this matter? Why does this book matter? Why are we talking about it 162 years after it was published? Why is it important?
It is amazing, isn't it? And at the time that this book was published, it of course became the foundation, the bedrock, if you like, of biology. But I think for me in the 21st century, this book says that all living things share a common origin. And in this book, he starts to hint, and later on in later books, he sort of confirms this, but he starts to hint here at the fact that humans are also related to other animals, and that we share a common origin with all living creatures. So this puts us humans firmly in nature and not above it, which was prior to this the sort of general belief that humans were in some way superior to other animals. And this personally leads me to feel that, we have responsibilities, if you like, that go with that. And what do you feel about on the origin?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, from a personal perspective, I'm a biologist. It's a bit of my identity. But without the origin of species, I mean, we wouldn't have the discipline of biological sciences. It just wouldn't exist. We could make up nice stories. We'd have natural philosophy, but we wouldn't have biology. We wouldn't have the science. But I also think, I mean, as you've alluded to, I mean, I think that we are at the beginning of what is potentially the 6th mass extinction event. There have been estimates say that we're losing species at maybe 1,000 times the normal background rate of extinction, and we are part of nature. And so I think this is telling us that we really have to step up to turn things around.
Yeah, and I think Darwin saw beauty in his theory of evolution.
Yes.
And he didn't want to give the impression that nature had somehow lost some of its beauty because it had evolved rather than being created by a creator. So this next quote is a sort of a nudge towards that beauty. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.
I just think that's lovely, and I know it might sound a bit silly to say it, but actually it does make the hairs go up on the back of my neck. It's poetry. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
The book is just a wonderful, wonderful book, and it's written. It's accessible. It's written for people to pick up and read and to understand. It wasn't written for a scientific elite, and it's poetic. It's taking a really complex idea and breaking it down and making it accessible and making it beautiful, and the writing is lovely. So thank you ever so much, Sarah.
Well, thank you, Neil.
Shall we take some questions?
Yeah, shall we see? Have we got any questions?
Let's have a look. There's quite some comments. Let's see.
Oh, wow. Yes, so there are.
Okay, so Elvira, do you think evolution in humans has slowed down due to scientific and medical advances, or is it faster than ever because of our increasing population and therefore gene pool? Wow. Yes. I think it's probably a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B. I mean, the one of the big issues that we have. Okay, taking a current topic, one of the reasons that we seem to have so many new variants popping up. There was an amazing graph of the original variant of COVID, and then this huge phylogenetic tree, this huge family tree of the virus, and there are hundreds of variants that have popped up. Now, most of them aren't going to make any difference to their infectivity or their danger or anything like that, but they're mutating, and mutation is evolution, or evolution is mutation. It's a circular argument, but the ability for it to reproduce, the number of cases where it is, the number of viruses out there taking it, the more there is, the more chance there is for it to reproduce. So it's a very difficult one to answer, and human evolution is one of the trickiest subjects because it can be a little bit of a hot potato in some respects. But I think it's really nice because one of the things that Darwin says is that the thing that makes humans special, and this is important. The thing that makes humans special is that actually we take ourselves out of the red in tooth and claw nature where individuals are allowed to slip off. We take care of the sick. We look after people, and that's right, because that's what makes us human. So we are changing maybe our genetic structure, but that's fine. That's okay. So yeah. It's a very tricky one, Elvira. Thanks very much for that one.
A tricky one.
It's a great question, and it isn't easy to answer. But I do think it's a little bit of column A and a little bit from column B. Sarah, I've just waffled on for a bit.
No. I was going to say there's a really nice comment from Dawn here saying, joining you from the chalk cliff tops of Sussex, sitting on the top of millenniums of creatures. Lovely to see you. That's really nice. Quite right, and really nice that you're sort of thinking of all those millions of years of creatures. I'm just looking to see if we've got.
So we've got a nice one from Edmund. Edmund says, question from my dad: does this theory entirely explain the bizarre diversity of life? Some things, are almost too nuts. Well, it depends what you're talking about. When you say two nuts, by what perspective? By what are we looking at? The whole thing comes down to the environment, to the selective pressure that something finds itself in. I was giving a lecture the other day about these extremophiles, these cyanobacteria that happily live in extremely hypersaline pools, these stromatolites, and how it relates all the way back to these things have been on the planet for 2 billion years or more. In fact, we've got some evidence that, some fossil evidence that they go back to sort of 3.8 billion years. They're not the most beautiful fossils, but they're pretty good. They're probably stromatolites. And this idea that they're extremophiles because they're living in very hypersaline environments, it's not extreme to them. That's what they evolved in 3.8 billion years ago, what they were really doing very well in by the time of 2 billion years. It's extreme by our perspective. And so bizarre, almost two nuts is by our perspective as terrestrial air breathing vertebrates. Life, wouldn't it be boring if we were all like us? It's beautiful and it's wonderful. And I think, yes, the theory absolutely can explain all of biodiversity.
Yeah, and of course some of the nutty things that we see, I always think the peacock tail is incredible, really. Maybe that's the sort of thing you're saying is nutty. And we're going to be covering the theory of sexual selection, which explains some of these extraordinary characteristics, which I think Darwin at one stage said he felt sick thinking about a peacock tail, didn't he? Because he realized that it couldn't be explained through.
He wrote that to Wallace. That was a letter to Wallace that he wrote.
It was a letter to Wallace. Well, there you go. So he came up with this theory of sexual selection, which we'll be covering in a few days' time, in 10 days' time.
Yes. So there is another question here. What inspired you both first to read On the Origin of Species? What inspired you both to become biologists? Oh, this is 3 questions, UOS Talk to Us. So what inspired you both to become biologists, and what's your favourite thing about being scientists? There we go. Sarah, would you like to take the first bit?
So inspired to become a biologist, I think I literally had a bit of a eureka moment, actually. Just sort of, in the depths of nature, I just suddenly thought, wow, I've got to. I was illustrating plants at the time, and I suddenly realised, wow, I've got to start studying plants. So that was very good. And what was the second half of the question? What inspired us both to start reading On the Origin of the Species for the first time? Well, I have to confess, I'm one of these scientists who read it rather late in life. I mean, it's a little awkward sometimes having a surname like Darwin because people assume that you're an expert. And in fact, I was, probably one of the very few people who could actually give a talk about Galapagos without mentioning Darwin, because you sort of think if you open your mouth about Darwin, there's always going to be somebody in the audience who knows more about it. So I kind of nearly resisted reading it. And it was only when I was lucky enough to follow in Darwin's wake around the world on a sort of a replica of a tea clipper that I sort of got into Darwin's writing and felt, since I'd done this incredible journey, that I was now sort of legitimate, if you like, in being able to have an opinion about his work, because I'd kind of visited some of the places that he'd seen and things. What about you, Neil?
Well, yes, to my shame, I didn't read it till I was quite late as well. And I'd taken a job in the States at a college, SUNY Oswego, and one of the lectures and one of the modules that I had to teach on was the seniors Bio 425 senior seminar, and what they all discussed was The Origin of Species. So I had to read it very, very quickly, and it was fun because I was living in small town America with quite conservative ideas, and so I cheated. I bought an audio book which I played on my iPod, so I could just sit on the bus going to work without having to reading The Origin of Species in Small Town America. It was an experience. It's an absolutely beautiful book, and since then, I've read it dozens of times. Any students who are around and might want to, when we can get back and after COVID, I do a book club where you come along and each week we read a chapter and we discuss it, and it's lovely. I just really enjoy it. I should have got to it earlier.
And here's one for you, Neil. Sam says, a bit off topic, but what is the model behind you, Neil? Not the Archaeopteryx, but the birdlike model.
The one, this lower one?
I think because do you want to bring it forward so that people can see it? Or
excuse me.
Yeah, because we haven't really talked about this sort of whole idea of the sort of missing link, if you like.
We haven't talked about his evidence, really. We've put forward the theory and put forward the information, but we haven't. The rest of the book, there's 15 chapters, and oh no, the stuffed bird. The stuffed bird is an Archaeopteryx plushie. But,
do I want you to talk about that that one?
Well, that is an Archaeopteryx as well. It's a plushie made by Rebecca Groom, who you can find on Facebook, who makes a series of beautiful stuffed toys and things called paleo plushies. I would recommend those. But this is stunning. Okay, so hanging up there, you can see my lovely cast of the Berlin Archaeopteryx, and I was very lucky last year, well, sort of October of, when would it have been, 2019. I went to Portsmouth City Museum, and they had a dodo exhibition, and an artist by the name of Karen Fawcett had made a beautiful life-size model of a dodo, absolutely stunning. And Christine Taylor at the Portsmouth City Museum was very kind and told me she makes Archaeopteryx too. Now, Archaeopteryx, I've got a thing for it. And what she's done is she's taken a cast. Oh, hang on. A cast of the Berlin Archaeopteryx, and then has built up over the top this beautiful representation of what the animal would have looked like. I mean, it's absolutely stunning, right the way down to its eye. Where can we see? I'm trying to manipulate my little camera, and I'm not doing very well, am I? Here we go. That's that way. It's absolutely its feet. You can see the scales on its feet. And you've got the eye. It's just, there's claws on its wings. It's absolutely beautiful. And for me, this is okay. So, just if you'll indulge me for a moment more, the Archaeopteryx for me is one of the most important fossils, because for a theory to be a good scientific theory, it's got to be testable. And one of the things Darwin says, chapter 10, imperfection of the fossil record, I think, as memory serves, I can't remember, I'm sorry. No, that's, yes, geological succession of organic beings, chapter 10, and then the imperfection of the fossil record. He says that if his idea is correct, if natural selection is a real thing, we should be able to find lots of transitional forms. Do you remember I was talking about dandelions, that some grow up at the top of the mountain and some grow down at the bottom? Well, the population started off in the middle. We should be able to find fossil record of that middle population, the ancestral population. But, Darwin was frustrated, to say the least, because these transitional forms just weren't popping up all the time. And he explained it quite nicely by saying, do you know what? They should be there. We should be able to find them if we look enough. But the fossil record is not perfect. In fact, it's missing great chunks. So it's not to be expected that we wouldn't, that we don't find them. However, in 1860, a beautiful fossil feather. This isn't Archaeopteryx, and this isn't the same age, but it is a lovely fossil feather. Okay, a beautiful fossil feather turned up in the lithographic limestone quarry in Solnhofen, and then in 1861, a whole body fossil turned up with an animal with jaws, with teeth in, a long bony tail, and feathers. And if you have feathers in 1850 something and 1860 something, you're a bird. But this wasn't a bird that anyone had seen before. Now, the one that turned up in 1861 and is the London specimen, and it's called that because it's held in the Natural History Museum in London, the same way as that's the Berlin specimen because it's in the Berlin Natural History Museum. This animal, this fossil, unites. It is beautiful. It unites the class Aves, birds, with the class Reptilia, reptiles. It's somewhere, if you take the feathers off, it's a small dinosaur fossil. You know, it looks like Compsognathus. You put the feathers on, oh, it's a bird. We now know that actually feathers don't evoke, they aren't a bird characteristic. They are because birds are the only things alive with feathers. But historically, feathers pop up in dinosaurs, which makes them really good. I mean, birds were great already. Now birds are dinosaurs. They're absolutely awesome. But Archaeopteryx is this transitional form. It shows it is a bird, but it's still got a lot of primitive characters, and it's wonderful. It's evidence that Darwin needed. And Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a great supporter of Darwin, wrote vast amounts on this. Richard Owen, Darwin's bulldog. Richard Owen, who was the director of the Natural History Museum and had no truck with natural selection, bought it for a massive. It was £700. He paid £700 in the mid 1860s, which was a phenomenal amount of money. The equivalent today, no museum buys anything for that equivalent money. He put it in, and he had it. It was a bird, as far as he was concerned. It was an unusual bird, but it was a bird. He didn't use it as an example of natural selection or evolution. But Thomas Henry Huxley absolutely saw it. And by the 1970s, John Ostrom was showing that there's so many similarities between things like Deinonychus, which if you watch Jurassic Park would be called Velociraptor. Velociraptor's actually only about 3 feet tall, still about 6 feet long. You wouldn't want to meet it in a dark alley, but it's not as big as the ones in the film. But John Ostrom described the bones of Deinonychus and showed that actually, yeah, this is the Maniraptor and dinosaurs are really bird-like. And in fact, most of the bird characteristics that we specify as birds are found in the dinosaurs. So I can really get going on that one. I'm sorry.
No, you really can. You're right. They are beautiful, beautiful specimens, and well worth going to whichever museum is nearest to you to have a look at Archaeopteryx, either in the Naturkunde Museum in Berlin or the Natural History Museum in London. So we have Moses asks what motivated Darwin in the first place to join the Beagle. Well, I think he was desperate to go on an expedition, and I think he actually really wanted to go to the Canary Islands, but a trip to the Canary Islands fell through. And then so Fitzroy, who was the captain on board the Beagle, was sort of aware that it could be quite a lonely place being a captain. And so he was looking for two things. Firstly, he was looking for a companion who he would sort of be a gentleman companion, I think they described him as. But also he I think he really wanted to find evidence for Noah's flood, actually. And he wanted to take a naturalist along with him. Normally, the naturalist would have also been the surgeon, and there was a surgeon with him, but McCormack wasn't so good on geology. And of course, Darwin had studied quite a bit of geology in the UK, so he's very knowledgeable. So he was invited to join as a gentleman companion, but also as a naturalist. And I don't know what he would have said had he known that the journey was going to be 5 years, because I don't think it was only supposed to be a few years, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Who knows whether that would have changed his mind. But anyway, that was his motivation. Of course, his family didn't want him to go, or his father particularly said, you know, you're going to embarrass your family, you're going to waste your time, you know, you need to settle down. And what was he, 22 at the time or something? You need to settle down and, start work, really. It was actually Charles's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, who managed to persuade Charles's father, Darwin's father, to allow him to go.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a wonderful story. I was reading in, I think it was The Voyage of the Beagle, but it was certainly Darwin writing about the trip he had before he left. And he took a boat basically around the south coast, around Kent, and up through the Thames estuary, and he didn't like it, but that wasn't enough to put him off going. So
yeah, of course, he got horribly seasick.
yes.
Yeah, and again, I think, well, in the total 5 years, I think he spent only a third of the time actually moving on board the ship. They spent a third of the time in harbour, and he spent a third of the time on land, because I think he really, really found it tough.
Yes.
Yeah.
And on top of that, even though he was meant to be sort of a companion for Fitzroy, they didn't really get on, and so they didn't speak for a lot of it.
Yes, I think Fitzroy had a bit of a temper, didn't he?
Yeah.
And the crew used to call him Hot Coffee because of his temper.
Yes.
Yeah, they definitely had fallings out, but in fact, I think they sort of muddled
they
along.
certainly made up by the end of it, and I believe they corresponded and were in touch, through letters, until unfortunately Fitzroy killed himself.
Yeah.
So Fitzroy is a really fascinating person, doomed by his own concerns and fears for what had gone before, shall we say?
Yeah. Yes. Now there's a question for you here. Jade asks, why are a lot of fossils' necks bent backwards?
Okay. So,
well, Archaeopteryx neck is definitely bent backwards.
Neck bent backwards. The dinosaurs as well. Basically, what happens is when they die, the tendons in the neck, in the skeleton, shrink, and they pull themselves around. So the head pulls towards the tail. So it's just the process of death and decay and the shrinkage of the tendons which pulls them around. So it's not quite as exciting as it maybe could be. But
yes, it certainly makes that Archaeopteryx look very dramatic.
It really does. It really does. It's actually, it's disconnected the spine from the pectoral girdle.
Wow.
It would have been, but that would have happened post mortem, so it wouldn't have worried you too much.
And there's Dawn asking if we can recommend a good on the origin of species. So many of them have tiny print. That's absolutely right. I've got one here that has actually really nice big print, and it's published in 2019 by the East India Publishing Company. I know you've got a favourite as well, haven't you, Neil?
I've got quite a few copies of The Origin. It's a really lovely, but this is a beautiful edition that came out recently that the Natural History Museum have published. It's actually it's a copy, an exact copy of one of their books, because you can see the bookmark, the library mark inside it. It's really lovely. It's a second edition. There were 6 in total. The last one he wrote in 1872. I think corrected. The text isn't huge, but it's certainly readable. But there are so many beautiful versions. One of my favourite, and it's a bit of an odd thing to say, but there's an absolutely beautiful graphic novel with it looks like a comic book, and there's little speech bubbles, and there's all sorts of things, and it's wonderful. The science is absolutely superb. It's beautifully illustrated. So that's a good one. There's a very nice American edition with an Archaeopteryx and a London specimen on the front, and it includes the essays that he wrote, the letters that he wrote in 1842 and 1844, which outlined evolution. And in exactly the same way as Alfred Russel Wallace sent him a letter in 1858 outlining his ideas, Darwin had outlined The Origin in 1842 and then expanded on it in 1844, and had sent it to his friends Thomas Henry Huxley, Charles Lyell, and Asa Gray, and Joseph Hooker. So they had these copies, which is one of the reasons why Darwin has primacy, because those letters existed, which were 14, 16 years older than the letter that Wallace sent to Darwin. However, both Wallace and Darwin were read out at the same night, on the 1st of July 1858 at the Linnaean Society. Neither of them were actually present, but there were, that their theories were published together as a meeting where they were given equal billing, if you like. Darwin didn't take any ideas. Wallace certainly wasn't treated unfairly, and they were really good friends. They were genuinely good friends.
Yeah, we probably should say here that Wordsworth Books have donated us some copies, haven't they? Which we are going to be able to give away.
We're going to be able to give away. So a shameless plug. We run my wife and I and Sarah, we're all involved in running a Facebook group called The Dinosaur on Your Windowsill. And in that, Wordsworth Books have very kindly donated several copies of The Origin, Voyage and Descent of Man, which we can give away as a winner's bundle, but then also some other individual copies of Descent of Man, which we can give to other people as well. So get involved, join the Facebook group as well, and there'll be competitions coming up over the next few weeks. So what else have we got? Why do you think, Harry says, why do you think natural selection seems to produce such beautiful structures, perhaps seeing such elegant and efficient solutions to problems? That is an excellent question. And you're absolutely right. There is the appearance of design in nature, okay, because everything seems to work so well. And that, again, that's another aspect of the time that has run through the age of the Earth for organisms to actually find a balance. One of the big problems today that is throwing everything out of kilter is that we are changing the environment far too quickly for things to keep up with it. So the adaptations, the evolution that organisms need to do, and I use need very lightly, but that they would need to do in order to keep up with the changing environment. They just can't. The environment's changing too quickly. But it does give us this, the history has given us this, the appearance of perfection. However, when you take things back and you look at things, what you start to notice is that actually natural selection can only work with what it's got. So I'm in my mid-40s now, and I have to admit I'm sitting in a relatively uncomfortable armchair, and getting up is quite a strain on my knees. That's because we have modified, as humans have evolved, we've modified our quadrupedal body with that lovely structure with a spine that hangs all of our intestines underneath and supports it all. And we've moved ourselves upright. And so now all of our weight is going through our knees, and knees do a pretty good job, but they're not perfect. Our eyes are lovely. Eyes are absolutely super, but they're also a brilliant example of natural selection and the fact that they're not perfect. You can't see it because it's a blind spot, but you have got a spot in your eye that doesn't work. It's because they're sort of wired backwards, and so the optic nerve comes through, innervates from the wrong side of the surface that detects light. So light enters your eye, it passes through a layer of cells, hits the light detecting cells, and then feeds forward and backwards through the optic nerve. If you want to find it, I use the idea that it's sort of like the aerial of your television coming down through the front of your television, from the back through the front, and then connected. There's this space in it. It doesn't quite work. If you want a perfect eye where the wiring is done properly, you need to look at octopuses. Their eyes are wonderful. And if you want an eye that can see even more colors, then have a look at the eye of the mantis shrimp that can see all kinds of different elements of the spectrum that we just can't even perceive. So it looks perfect and it's good enough, and that's all it has to be. It just has to be that little bit better. The variation has to, if it gives you an advantage over the other members of your other organic beings that you are living amongst, you have that advantage. You go on to breed, and your characteristics get passed on to the next generation, and maybe over time there'll be further improvements, but it's just tinkering with what it's got. But it looks great and it works really well, and the diversity of life is amazing. I'm looking at the time, and I'm very aware that we are almost at the end, and there are a couple of things that I need to say. I'm sorry that we haven't answered all of your questions.
Yeah.
And I'm really, really chuffed that you've asked so many. What I do need to say, however, is an absolutely huge thank you to Sarah for talking to me.
Thank you, Neil.
It's been really lovely. But also a huge thank you to our technical support. We've got Thea and Sylvia in Southampton, and we have Mark at the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin. Thank you ever so much. It's been really super.
Yeah, and we will be back. Darwin's Armchair will be back on the 24th of February to celebrate the 150th anniversary of sexual selection, as outlined in his book, The Descent of Man. Darwin mentions sexual selection in The Origin of Species, but doesn't go into that much detail. This theory aims to explain, as we were talking earlier about the peacock, why it has such a luxuriant tail, and while the male nightingale can sing such a complex song for up to 23 hours a day.
Super. Before you all run away, before you go, we would really, really appreciate your thoughts and to know what you think about this event. So if you can, on the screen now, you can see that there's a QR code. So if you've got the app on your phone where you can scan it and you can go through, there's a short anonymous survey that you could fill out. Otherwise, in the chat, there's a little link and you can follow that through as well. We'd really like to know what you think so that we can improve and make this better next time. And finally, please don't forget, this is the first, it's like a preliminary event. I've been speaking too much. My tongue's gone out of gear. This is a preliminary event in the Southampton Science and Engineering Festival programme. We call it SOTSEF. It's going to be taking place next month. That's the 5th to the 14th of March. And it's all online. It's if you go to the festival site, sotsef.co.uk, you can find the programme, you can find dates for your diary and how to book free events. Thank you ever so much. It's been absolutely lovely talking to you. I'm sorry about the technical hitch at the beginning.
Yes, sorry about that.
I hope that it didn't spoil it too much for you, and hopefully we'll see you on the 24th.
It created nearly a rap song, actually, Neil.
It was this self-building. It was lovely. What can I say? Of chaos came order. No,
Yeah, thank you all very much for joining us.